So hello and welcome dear friends. Let's move on to the final elemental cycle from your syllabus, that is the sulfur cycle. Apart from this, the biogeochemical events which takes place in nature involves many cycles. But we have seen the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, and the final cycle from your curriculum, that is the sulfur cycle. Before venturing into the transformations which this element undergoes in nature, let us see some facts related with sulfur. We'll begin with whether to pronounce it as sulfur or sulfur. That is a sulfur with a F or sulfur with a P. Sulfur has been preferred to be pronounced as sulfur with a F, that is SULFUR, by International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry, that is IUPAC, since 1990. And this is the default form of spelling which is used in all journals, scientific journals. If you are representing your work in a scientific journal, you have to pronounce it as sulfur, that is SULFUR. The alternative spelling, which is sulfur, that is a PHUR, also pronounced as sulfur only, but the spelling is PHUR, may still be found in some of the UK based and Commonwealth based countries and their publications, and also especially by the common man or the layman, this SULPHUR is used. But as I said, by default the scientific pronunciation and writing is SULFUR, the F form. Even in this slides, if in the further presentation, if somewhere PHUR comes, just ignore it and you should remember that the correct spelling is FUR. So by extension, all the sulfur derived words are also spelled in the F form, like disulfite, polysulfane, sulfate, sulfide, sulfites, sulfonamide, sulfuric acid, sulfurous, sulfuryl, so on and so forth. So F form is used, that is the point. Second important fact or some related fact, this is a yellow colored compound. It is obtained by mining by humans. But before going to that, let us see some facts associated with sulfur. Sulfur is essential to all living beings, living things. It is taken up as sulfate from the soil or the oceans by plants and algae. Means we derive our sulfur from the plant derived products. Even some animal products like eggs, etc., may contain sulfur. Sulfur is involved in two essential amino acids, as you can see, cysteine and methionine. There is a third molecule called as cysteine, but this cysteine is nothing but combination of two cysteine molecules by the disulfide linkages, that is the sulfahydryl group. The sulfur group of one cysteine molecule, it associates with the sulfahydryl group of another cysteine molecule to give rise to protons, and the disulfide linkages of two cysteine molecule results into a molecule called as cysteine. These are the amino acids which form an essential part of the protein structure. So it is used to make two of the essential amino acids, cysteine and methionine. Cysteine is not the third amino acid, it is just two cysteine molecules coming close to form one cysteine molecule. So if you are having a question about the sulfur containing amino acids, there are two sulfur containing amino acids and they are cysteine. So sulfur is the 10th most common element by mass and the 5th most common element on the earth. Means by mass it is the 10th most common element in the universe and 5th most common element on the earth. Historically, the sulfur name or the literature is in the history you will find it as termed as brimstone, which means as burning stone. So when it comes in contact with air, it has a tendency to catch fire. So therefore it's also called as brimstone or burning stone. Today almost all of the elemental sulfur which is there is produced as a byproduct of removing the sulfur containing contaminants from natural gas and petroleum. So for fossil fuel derived sulfur is the mass production on the earth today by humans. The greatest commercial use of this element is to produce biofertilizers, that is sulfuric acid for sulfate and phosphate fertilizers. The element sulfur or sulfates, they are used in insecticides, pesticides, matches, fungicides and fertilizers. Many sulfur containing compounds, they are having a typical pungent smell, odoriferous in nature, and they smell of that natural sulfur gas. Okay, so that odorized natural gas, and even in garlic, if you see the pungent smell of garlic is due to the sulfur containing compound, that is organosulfur in the garlic. So there are many foodstuffs which contain sulfur, and that is beneficial for our body. So H2S or hydrogen sulfide, it gives a characteristic odor. When this sulfur is converted into gaseous form, it gives a typical odor, and that you can see when the eggs they rot or other biological processes, when there is a tertiary degradation, that is a tertiary level of sewage treatment. If you see, there is a pungent smell in the tertiary level of sewage treatment, and mostly there H2S gas is produced by the microorganisms. So these are some of the aspects related with sulfur. Sulfur is also a very important component of most of the biological systems, and as I said, 3 amino acids, but basically only 2 amino acids, cysteine, cysteine and methionine, and 2 vitamins, biotin and thiamine, they are organosulfur compounds, means sulfur containing compounds. Many cofactors, they also contain sulfur, which include glutathione, thioredoxin and iron sulfur proteins. The disulfide bonds between two molecules, it provides the strength or the mechanical strength and insolubility to the protein in which these two disulfide linkages are present, that is cysteine molecules are present. Like for example, a strand of hair. If you see this hair, it has strong disulfide linkages, and the weak linkages, they are of some salt and water. Whereas this protein keratin, which is a major protein in the hair follicles, the strength of the hair is due to disulfide linkages. The hair follicles, they are made up of keratin, and when sulfur is readily available, keratin is made from strong disulfide linkages. When there is not enough sulfur available in the body, it creates a keratin with much weaker bonds, and hair loss is there. So sulfur is one of the core chemical elements which is needed for biochemical functioning and is a macronutrient in all the living systems. So these are the examples of some organosulfur compounds with respect to its utility by man. So in garlic, as you can see, allicin is a compound. It is a natural sulfur containing compound, allicin. Then cysteine is amino acid which contains a thiol group. As I said, cysteine, 2 molecules bound to form cysteine. Methionine is also amino acid which contains sulfur. Diphenyl disulfide is a representative disulfide. Then perfluorooctanosulfanic acid is a surfactant which is usually used in detergents. And dibenzothiopene is a component of crude oil. This you can see here, in a barrel of crude oil, 0.7% sulfur is there. So these are the organosulfur compounds, means in human utility, the sulfur has not only a significant role in the formation of the body, that is the growth systems, but outside that, commercial value of sulfur is also there. Just a brief idea about the garlic and the sulfur containing components of garlic I would like to signify here. 2 things you should have understood: that eating garlic causes bad breath, means a pungent smell. Why is that so? Because of the allicin, which is allyl methyl sulfide, and it is a sulfur containing compound. There are 4 major volatile organic compounds which are responsible for bad breath, that is diallyl sulfur, as you can see here, diallyl sulfur, allyl methyl sulfur, allyl mercaptans and allyl methyl disulfide. Diallyl trisulfides are also there. These are volatile compounds, so when you eat it and when your breath, it accumulates that volatile compounds which contain sulfur. What are the four ones? That is diallyl disulfide, allyl methyl sulfide, allyl mercaptans, and allyl methyl disulfide. These are the four volatile sulfur containing compounds due to which eating garlic gives a bad breath. Secondly, garlic is also having a very significant role in antimicrobial and antifungal nature. Antimicrobial properties of garlic are attributed to diallyl sulfide, diallyl disulfide, and diallyl trisulfide. Means all sulfur containing organic components of the garlic give the garlic some antimicrobial properties. Antimicrobial effects, they have been shown to increase as the sulfur atoms they increase in the product, anything, it may be garlic or any plant product. More the number of sulfur atoms, more antimicrobial activity it has. So mostly, as I have just told, allicin is formed initially when garlic is crushed, and that allicin also has antimicrobial properties. So this is one area of research for the pharmaceutical or the chemicals and pharmaceutical components for production of industrially important compounds. So that was additional information for the students who wish to carry out some projects in this area. So the biological importance of garlic, as I just said, it is a component of two important amino acids, methionine and cysteine. Therefore it is a major component of all the proteins, enzymes, vitamins, etc. Then this sulfur, it also forms a biological precursor, as I said, for many polypeptides, proteins. Then it is a component of cysteine, methionine, glutathione, methionine, sulfoxide, then S-methylcysteine, homocysteine. These are all the biological biochemical precursor molecules, the intermediates which are formed during the metabolism. So sulfur has a big biological significance with respect to the life systems. Now, where is this sulfur formed? The majority of the earth's sulfur is stored in rocks underground in the soil and at the bottom of the ocean. Humans, they are constantly mining this sulfur from the oceans as well as from the land mines, due to which there is a huge ecological imbalance that I will show you in the end. But let us just venture into the sulfur cycle. So how this, when we are seeing any biogeochemical cycle, how these elements they circulate in the environment from the crust of the earth to the atmosphere, back to the soil, then maybe again to the earth's core or the crust, and then again into the atmosphere. This cycling is called as this transformation, and the cycling is called as an elemental cycle. So the sulfur, it all starts with the sediments. You can see sediment of sulfates and sulfides are there. These sediments are washed off, that is runoff takes place with water deposition on the land. That is, when there is rain, the atmospheric sulfur as well as the sedimented sulfates and sulfides in the soil, they are run off and they are added in the water. Or maybe that these sulfates and sulfides which are present in combination with other elements like calcium sulfate is there, magnesium sulfate is there, potassium sulfate, these are not in the soluble form. So weathering as well as rains, acid rains, they convert this insoluble form of sulfur into soluble form, which is now available for the plants to uptake. These plants, they uptake it, then the living system like humans, animals, insects, maybe microorganisms, they utilize these sulfur, soluble sulfur. Microorganisms, they can utilize directly the soluble sulfur from the soil, whereas plants, they uptake it and we uptake it from the plants. That is, biomagnification occurs. Sulfur is transferred from soil to plants. From plants it is consumed by animals. Animals, when they die, they are decomposed, and then that decomposed waste product is subjected to soil, and in the soil again the microorganisms, they are converting it. So there is a cycle. This cycle, mineralization, assimilation, then decomposition, release of this sulfur back to the atmosphere, so on and so forth. Human activities like mining, smelting, burning of fossil fuels. Even when you drive a car, you are burning a fossil fuel. That is, when a petrol or a diesel is burnt through vehicles, the gas which is emitted through the silencer, there it contains some sulfur gas, sulfur components which is added into the atmosphere. So sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, these are the gaseous forms of sulfur which are added in the as the form of sulfates in the atmosphere. So the cycling of this sulfur, if you see, it is from the natural rocks, weathering of the rocks, acid rains which falls on the ground, then the soil for sulfur, as well as the rock sulfur which is there, that is drained off into the water, oceans, lakes, streams, estuaries, and there from the top the algal plants, blooms, or some plants, phytoplanktons, they will be uptaking it and they will grow. But most of the sulfur which is deposited at the bottom of the sea, that will over the long run, means thousands and millions of years, that will again be converted into the ores or rocks and mountains, and it again becomes a part of the rock sulfates and rock sulfur. Okay, so this is how the circulation of sulfur takes place. But here one important thing is to be understood, that sulfur, when it recycles, it is recycling in various states, oxidation states, means reduced form of sulfur to the most oxidized form of sulfur. There is convergence, and that convergence is brought about partly by the weathering process and partly by the microorganisms in the soil. So our main area of discussion will be microorganisms in the soil. I will come to that, but before, you see the microbial transformations. So these sulfide minerals which are there in the center, they are converted to sulfate, this sulfate by reduction reaction by microorganisms. These sulfates, they are assimilated into sulfides again by fungi, prokaryotes and plants. So this organic sulfur is again released back, or may be utilized, it may be mineralized, it can be desulfurized, oxidation, dissimilative reaction, oxidation, reduction. These reactions are continuously carried out either by the weather elemental processes or by the microbial processes. So this is a bird's eye view of the microbial processes which is going on in nature. And with respect to microorganisms, I will explain this later on. Here I just want to give you an idea of where in the microorganism, in which component, in which organelle of the microorganism this sulfur cycle is carried out. So this is cytoplasm. You can see the phospholipid bilayer and the membrane proteins which are there, the cytoplasmic membrane, phospholipid bilayer and the periplasm. There in this there are components, proteins floating, and these allow not only transport of the nutrients but also carry out some very important reactions of the respiratory electron transport system, like ATPase enzyme. Here orange, you can see the three colors are there. Blue is of the hydrogenase enzyme system, the green is the sulfur utilizing sulfur reductase enzyme system. Sulfur reductase enzyme is in green, hydrogenase is in blue, and there is in orange or yellow, you can see this is the ATPase enzyme. So three enzymes are shown in a lipid bilayer of a bacterial cell, and as you can see, this ATPase constantly synthesizes ATP molecules by utilization of protons. These protons, they are generated here by quinone. K is for quinone. Quinone based protons are generated. Even in the hydrogenase enzyme system, you can see how these are interlinked. That is what I want to show you. Hydrogenase enzyme, there are three subunits. It is constantly producing two protons, hydrogen, and these two protons are used by sulfur in the sulfur reductase, and H2S is formed. What I want to show you here is how a microbial cell is responsible for metabolic production of hydrogen sulfide gas. And here bacterial metabolism and the sulfur cycle, in the periplasm or the cytoplasm, there are enzymes floating on the phospholipid bilayer. This phospholipid bilayer itself is a phosphorus containing element containing membrane we saw in the last lecture. So the point which you have to understand here is that in the cytoplasm there is a sulfur reductase enzyme which is floating, which utilizes the ATP synthesized from the ATPase enzyme machinery is present somewhere in nearby, and hydrogen which is derived from hydrogenase enzyme system, and then there is formation of H2S gas. That is how the enzymatic mechanism of all the sulfur reducing bacteria it takes place. So before actually venturing into details of the sulfur cycle, I would like to throw some light on the redox reactions which are taking place in the biogeochemical cycles in nature, and how bacterial metabolism is related to that. Bacterial metabolism is mainly dependent upon the redox reactions. All the chemical reactions, they consist of transferring the electrons from a donor to an acceptor. Means electrons are transferred from donor to an acceptor. Chemicals which donate the electrons, they are called, or they become oxidized. When a chemical it donates an electron, it gets oxidized, and when a chemical which accepts an electron, it becomes reduced. So like this, sulfur is involved in oxidation and reduction of itself. Means sulfur accepts and donates electrons, it gets oxidized and reduced, and there are some 4 to 6 elemental forms of sulfur which I will show you in the next slides. Energy is released during these electron transfers, and in order to capture that energy, to trap that energy, you can say intercept that energy has to be intercept for other metabolic reactions. The bacteria or the microorganisms, they capture these electrons during the redox reactions, and when the sulfur is the electron capturing element, then we say it is a chemolithotropic bacteria. If it is a oxygen molecule, it is aerobic system, so on and so forth. So the terminal electron acceptor concept here in these microorganisms is sulfur. Why this thing is important? Because in a chemolithotropic bacteria where the terminal electron acceptor is sulfur, the goal of metabolism, that is by accepting this and transforming it into energy, the energy released during redox reactions helps in generating high energy molecules like ATP. There are different strategies across the biological kingdom and the microbial kingdom to conserve this energy. They do this by fermentation. Then in fermentation there is transfer of electrons to the organic substrate, whereas in respiration by microorganisms, transfer of electrons to inorganic acceptor, like which we are seeing here in the sulfur as a terminal electron acceptor. So you know very well about fermentation, and you know very well about respiration. I will not venture into details. You can pause this slide and read it. The series of chemical reactions which are involved in fermentation or respiration with respect to the redox reactions which accomplish this complete oxidation is with the help of Krebs cycle or Tca cycle. Okay, and sulfur, when it is reduced, or the sulfate reduction, it is a metabolic process. Obligate anaerobes, that is the anaerobic bacteria, they either utilize hydrogen sulfide or organic compounds as electron donors and sulfur as electron acceptors. You can see here the red line is anabolism, where nitrogenous compound, phosphate, cell components are formed by utilizing sulfur, nitrogen, phosphorus, etc. the compounds, and the black line here is catabolism, where the breakdown of the components takes place. So while breaking down the sulfur, it gets transferred into various elemental states. The most important component where this redox reactions takes place is the electron transport chain, or the ETS, or the electron transport system. The carriers in this electron transport systems, they are regenerated by passing the electrons and protons. That is, there is oxidation reduction, shuttling of the electron takes place within the components of the RETC, and the amount of energy is generated, and the amount is dependent upon what is the terminal electron acceptor present there. So here we are dealing with a system where the terminal electron acceptor is sulfur. So this all is needed because ATP is needed. One of the most important molecule is ATP, and accumulation of all these protons on the outside of the cell membrane, it produces a slight electric charge, and that electric gradient is called as the proton motive force. This proton motive force is one important system which drives the ATP synthesis. Now all these biogeochemical cycles which we have seen till date, this works on the redox principles, and different nutrients, different elements, they undergo redox reactions as electron donors and acceptors during the bacterial metabolism. These reactions, they help the cycle, they help to recycle the nutrients throughout the nature in different chemical forms. We have seen very interesting and important chemical cycles. Today we will discuss the sulfur cycle. So the sulfur biogeochemistry, if you see this number of sulfur atoms, 8 electrons between stable redox states exist in sulfur. This sulfur can polymerize with other sulfur molecules forming disulfides, trisulfides, tetrasulfides, etc. It can circularize or exist in a cyclic form. It can be reduced, it can be oxidized. There can be an intermediate form of neither reduced nor oxidized sulfur. Thousands of organic sulfur forms and organosulfur compounds exist in nature, which have a thiol group, that is SH group, or a thioester group, or a thioester and a sulfonate group, which are oxidized forms of sulfurs, so on and so forth. So it exists in thousands of forms, and all these forms are transformed molecules of sulfur. Now if you see the basic global sulfur cycle, now I am not talking about microbial, but the global sulfur cycle, where these sulfur dynamism exists on the land, that is dynamic activity of sulfur, where does it exist on the land. So first of all, sediments, as you can see, the ocean sediments, they are rich in sulfur. All the yellow component which you see is sulfur. Now the sediments, as you go down deep, there is rock solid sulfur present. It is present in the depths of the ocean, it is present in the depths of the land. You can see even in the land. Okay. When there is a reduced sulfur compound released by biogenic emissions from the ocean, that is in the form of H2S, okay, or the sulfates, the sea spray which is there, even dust in the form of sulfates, sulfides, gas during volcanic emissions, it is released in the atmosphere, which is transported or carried to the land by clouds and the rain and other deposits. It is carried to the land, and there can be dry deposition or the rain runoff, that is the runoff from the land may again bring back that sulfur back to the oceans. So biogenic emissions by microorganisms may also exist, but that is very small, and the plants, they uptake it from the land. Once this sulfur is again added into the water, it will sediment down. What happens with the sedimented sulfur in the oceans? That again forms rocks and mountains, or sedimentary rocks and igneous rocks of the earth's core or the earth's mantle. Okay, so that is how this sulfur, it moves in the earth's atmosphere. Now if you see the pools, major pools where on the earth is sulfur concentrated, where it is present more and where it is present less. Major pools of cycle, lithosphere is there. Then in the terrestrial environment, soil organic matter, it holds the most amount of sulfur. As you can see, atmosphere, it contains some 3.6 into 10 to the power 9 kg sulfur. Hydrosphere, oceans, marine organisms, fresh water, igneous rocks, metamorphic rocks, sedimentary rocks, soils, biosphere, all they are having some or the other amount of sulfur. The major sulfur is present in lithosphere on the land, and lithosphere and in soil organic matter. That has to be understood. So like all other elements, sulfur, it exists in various oxidation states. Which are the oxidation states? From -2 of hydrogen sulfide to +6 of sulfur trioxide, there are, or SO4 2-, that is sulfates, +6 of sulfates, there is a oxidation state of sulfur. Reduction of sulfate or sulfide occurs via various intermediates. So you can see the most reduced form of sulfur is H2S or HS, which is having oxidation state of 2. In my last lecture I had explained what is oxidation state, and whereas sulfur trioxide or sulfuric acid, it is having the most oxidized state, that is +6. Intermediate forms are there: thiosulfate, tetrathionate, polysulfide, etc. So unlike nitrite or nitrate reducing bacteria, sulfur reducing bacteria, they do not usually release the intermediate components. These intermediate components, they are formed as a part of the reaction, but they are not released in nature. Only the final product sulfide is released. H2S or sulfides are released. Okay, this is one important aspect with respect to the oxidation states. Now this oxidation states, as you can see, the formula for S2, that is sulfide, S8 elemental sulfur, S2O4 2 minus hyposulfite, SO3 2 minus is sulfite. In the further lecture I will just be telling this as SO3 2 minus, which means it is a sulfite, or S2O3 2 minus, which means it is a thiosulfite. Thiosulfite, as you can see, the reduced form is getting more and more oxidized form, and the oxidation state is increasing. Dithionate, S2O6 2 minus, then trithionate, S3O6 2 minus, S4O6 2 minus is tetrathionate, and S5O6 is pentathionate, SO4 2 minus is sulfate. So this is the most oxidized form of sulfur. So these are the oxidation states and the compound name for your information. Now this is how, as you can see here, the most reduced form S2 minus to the most oxidized form, that is SO4 2 minus, by biological oxidation takes place. So when the sulfate is reduced, it becomes S2 minus, and when sulfate is oxidized, it becomes SO4 2 minus. So these sulfate reduction and sulfate oxidation can be assimilatory or dissimilatory. We will see that what does that mean. So most of the sulfur deposits in the land, they are converted into utilizable soluble form, and during the process it is transformed into various oxidation states. These oxidation states, they exist in the reaction only, they are not released in the environment. Only the final end product of sulfide is released in the environment. So this is a broad overview of the sulfur cycle. This sulfur which is there can be reduced, that is by assimilatory reduction or dissimilatory reduction, to form H2S gas. In the intermediate, organic sulfur is there, which is mineralized later on. Sulfur oxidation also takes place by this H2S, and it is oxidized to SO4 2 minus. So oxidation reduction reactions, these are the key reactions in the sulfur cycle. So you can see here in this beautifully explained cycle, SO4 2 minus to H2S, that is the most reduced form to the most oxidized form, takes place either in the aerobic condition, which is on the top, or in the anaerobic condition, which is at the bottom. The red arrows, they show reduction reactions, the white, they show that there are no redox changes, and the yellow, they show oxidation reactions. I will come to that, but this is in general how the shuttling or the shuffling of the transformation of sulfur takes place. So I already explained how this sulfur cycle is taking place in the nature. Acidic rain precipitation, it allows the acid rains, due to which the sulfates in the soil, they are converted into soluble form. The microorganisms also solubilize or oxidize the sulfur. Decomposition and other decaying reaction adds the sulfur back into the soil. Plants, they uptake it, so on and so forth. This is a sulfur cycle which we have already seen. With respect to microorganisms, the sulfur cycling is a small reaction in the ecosystem, but with respect to sulfur cycling and microorganisms, this is what happens in nature. Sulfur in the aerobic condition and anaerobic condition, it is transformed from one state, oxidized state or reduced state, to the another. So you can see here H2S, the most reduced form, to SO4 2 minus, most oxidized form by the organism. H2S, which is converted to elemental sulfur by purple and green phototrophic bacteria. The oxidized sulfur, that is SO4, is reduced by desulfovibrio bacteria. In the intermediate, elemental sulfurs are formed, and this elemental sulfur is further transformed to reduced form of sulfur. Decomposition by microorganisms, which takes place with respect to the dead and decaying organisms, where also the sulfur is released, and sulfhydryl groups of proteins, all they are released back, that is by microorganisms, and that is dissimilation. Dissimilatory process is removing, that is breaking down, and assimilatory process is conversion, that is forming the molecules, forming the biomass, that is growth. Okay, so this takes place in aerobic and anaerobic conditions. Variety of microorganisms in the soil, they are capable of doing this reaction. Now let us see the sulfate reduction and how the protons are, from where the protons are acquired for this sulfur to get reduced. So for sulfur to get reduced, it requires electrons. These electrons, the protons, that is the proton motive force which drives these reactions, is provided by the Tca cycle. Some of the components of the Tca cycle, they are diverted to formation of lactic acid, that is lactate, acetate, etc. As you can see here in this reaction, that is lactate, acetate to acetate via pyruvate, acetyl-CoA, acetyl phosphate. During these reactions, that is lactate to pyruvate, you can see 2 hydrogen plus electrons are released. Pyruvate to 2 CoA, acetyl-CoA, that is with the decarboxylation reaction, 2 hydrogen plus electrons are released. Acetyl-CoA to acetyl phosphate, then 2 CoASH, this is released, and ATP is formed, 2 ATP is formed. All these protons or electrons, they are acquired by the sulfate compounds in the vicinity or in the reaction wherever they are available, and the most reduced form of the sulfur to most oxidized form, or most oxidized form to the most reduced form, by assimilatory process or dissimilatory process, it takes place in the sulfur metabolism inside the cell. So this is broadly how the H2S, that is the reduced form to SO4 2 minus, that is the most oxidized form, it shuttles and shuffles in the intermediate with the help of electrons and protons, and it gets converted into the S2O3, S4O6, SO3, finally SO42. These intermediate compounds, they do not get liberated, they are a part of the reaction, and this is how the sulfur cycle, it is carried out in the microbial system. As I mentioned earlier, the anaerobic sulfur reduction and the electron transport system, they share a very interesting mechanism in the cell membrane. You can see this as a hypothetical view of the elemental sulfur reduction and anaerobic electron transport chain as studied in acidanous ambivalence, that is organism acidanous ambivalence, which reduces the sulfur. So this is an enzyme called as sulfur reductase enzyme. These 3 enzyme systems, they are coded with 3 different colors. One is the blue, other is green, and the third is orange or the yellowish one. So this blue is hydrogenase enzyme system. All these are in the same organism, that is acidanous ambivalence. So this is an example of anaerobic sulfur reduction where H2S gas is formed. For this reaction, electrons, protons are needed. From how it is derived, from where it is derived, and the elemental sulfur reduction, how does it takes place? It takes place in the anaerobic electron transport chain, and the protons, these are which are assumed to be translocated to the periplasm here. These protons, they are translocated to the periplasm via quinone, that is K6H. This is quinone molecule. Only major structural subunits are shown here. Subunits of the hydrogenase enzyme system, that is, you can see HYNL. This is one subunit. HYN stands for hydrogenase. L, S and the I, these are the components. A heme component, iron containing component is there, and this is responsible for the hydrogenation reaction, and 2H and electrons are liberated. Now this 2H and protons or the electrons, they are translocated through the periplasm or the cytoplasm to sulfur reductase system as well as the ATP synthetase enzyme system. Here ATP is constantly generated by this beautiful biological motor-like enzyme, where it rotates and converts all the ADPs to ATP. Here you can see ADP is converted to ATP. Wherever there is ATP utilized, one inorganic phosphate is donated and ADP molecule results. This is also driven by a proton motive force, and this proton motive force, which accepts two protons, that is the same mechanism by the sulfur reductase enzyme system, where it accepts two protons and the elemental sulfur is reduced to H2S. So this is one reaction which goes on with the help of the enzyme sulfur reductase, and you can see the components, the subunits of the enzymes. These are labeled as sulfur reductase A, sulfur reductase B and sulfur reductase C. So this is the at the molecular level reduction of sulfur in microorganisms. Now this dissimilatory sulfate reduction, we have seen the anaerobic one, dissimilatory sulfate reduction, where dissimilation takes place, that is decomposition and decaying takes place with respect to metabolism. In metabolism there are two types of reactions: catabolism, where the cell components, they utilize energy by breakdown, and anabolism, where energy is utilized for growth, that is cellular accumulation. So the catabolism, the energy metabolism is shown in black here. The compounds, they are utilized, carbon dioxide and H2S is released. When organic compounds are utilized, carbon dioxide, that is respiration, whereas when sulfur, oxidized sulfur, organic sulfur is utilized, that is reduced to H2S. How this H2S gas is converted in anaerobic system, we just saw in the previous slide. Sulfur reduction, it takes place, oxidation and reduction. There is one intermediate reaction called as sulfur disproportionation. Sulfur disproportionation means the inorganic sulfur intermediates at a moderate temperature are microbiologically, that is enzymatically converted, that is elemental sulfur, which is as an intermediate elemental sulfur is formed, and sulfide and sulfate both serve as electron donors and acceptors, and they generate hydrogen sulfide and sulfate. So when a elemental sulfur is formed as an intermediate during the oxidation and reduction reaction, the disproportionation of inorganic sulfur, it takes place. The disproportionation of inorganic sulfur intermediates at moderate temperatures are catalyzed by enzymes which are secreted by microorganisms, and it is a chemolithotrophic process, means it is a completely inorganic type of process in which compounds like elemental sulfur, thiosulfate and sulfite, they serve as electron donors and electron acceptors, and by doing this they generate hydrogen sulfide or sulfate molecules. So sulfur reduction, sulfur oxidation, sulfur disproportionation, as you can see, these are the reactions, major reactions of the sulfur cycle. Now this is one slide which shows you the transformation or the mobility of sulfur in three spheres. The green one is atmosphere, the yellow is soil, and the blue is groundwater. Groundwater, ocean water, or water where the sulfur it deposits, and after deposition at the bottom it again goes on to form minerals, that is rocks, and that is a long time process which takes thousands and thousands of years. So atmosphere, in the atmosphere you can see all the input, it basically starts with the soluble sulfur from the rocks or in the soil. Now if you see here, follow the red laser light. If you see the soluble sulfate here, how many reactions are there which goes on to get assimilated, means assimilatory reactions. In the soil there is sulfur which is in the form of sulfates. By some reaction, let us say microbial reaction or the weathering, it gets converted into soluble sulfate. So this soluble sulfate is a reaction by microbial processes or natural processes. Now just I want you to concentrate on this soluble sulfate and how many reactions are assimilating it. Very few, two only. See here, this is one where assimilation by plants takes place on the surface of the atmosphere. One, assimilation by plant. These numbers 5 to 20, this is kilogram per hectare per year of sulfur. So all these numericals, they represent kilogram sulfur per hectare per year. So you see soluble sulfate here is assimilated by plants, one. Then second reaction is immobilized to microbial biomass. Means when I say this soluble sulfate is converted into soluble form, that is insoluble sulfate is converted into soluble form by microorganisms. Why they are doing that? They are doing that for cell mass production also. They grow in their numbers. So when microorganisms get converted from 1 to 100,000, 10,000, that 10,000 microorganisms, they also assimilate this sulfur. Microbial biomass contains sulfur, that is called as immobilization. Even this plant, when they accumulate that, it is some sort of immobilization, but we will not call it as immobilization because this plant ultimately has two fates. One is it will be dead and added back into the soil where it will be decomposed, or this plant will be consumed by animals or humans and there it will enter into the next level of the food chain. So assimilatory process is very few here, immobilization. Then rest, or the third you can see, it is leaching. The soil soluble sulfate either is assimilated by the plant, is assimilated as microbial biomass, or it is leached into the groundwater. Only three reactions. What are rest of the reactions? Once this plant accumulates it, then either crop removal or decomposition takes place. This plant has other inputs of sulfur also, like atmospheric sulfur input, rainwater, fertilizer, sulfur fertilizer which is added into the soil which becomes soluble sulfate, atmospheric sulfur by rain it becomes soluble sulfate, or atmospheric sulfur it is directly taken up by plants. Just follow the laser light, you will understand things. This whole complexity is very simple to understand. Soil, it is added with the artificial sulfur fertilizer and it either is added into soil where the plants they uptake it, or it gets leached, okay, or it is absorbed in the rocks in the form of sulfate. That is what happens with the atmospheric or the fertilizer sulfur. Then in the groundwater there can be a capillary rise, that is due to capillary action the sulfur can rise and become a part of the soil, again soluble sulfates. Okay, the microbial biomass, when they themselves die off, they mineralize to again give back soluble sulfur to the soil. Or the microbial biomass, they become a component of the soil organic matter, which the soil by erosion or again through a long time process gets converted again into sulfur rocks and sulfur mountains. Okay, organic sulfate or carbon bounded sulfur leaching and again goes sediments in the soil, forms rock sulfur or goes into the bottom, into the groundwater, so on and so forth. Okay, so this is how you can just see the sulfur, it mobilizes off in the nature cycle, in the atmosphere, in the soil and in the oceans, groundwater, sedimentation. One of the most important reaction is the physical weathering of this sulfur present in rocks, mountains or soil, and release of sulfides, HS, or sulfates from minerals. The rocks, minerals which are containing, there is huge deposits of sulfur in the ground, in the sea water, and these are transformed into sulfides and sulfates by physical weathering, that is rains. Biological transformation also takes place here by the microorganisms, which these are called as SOM or the sulfur oxidizing microorganisms or sulfur oxidizing bacteria, where or which are capable of converting the sulfide to sulfate, and sulfate is assimilated, this sulfate, this microbial biomass, by the aerobic transformation with the presence of air. As I said, there are two main reactions. In the next slide I will show you two main reactions of sulfur assimilation, that is aerobic and anaerobic. In the aerobic process, sulfur oxidizing bacteria, they convert the sulfides to sulfates, and that is assimilated by plants and microbes. In the anaerobic process, sulfate reducing bacteria, there are 5 groups, only 5 groups of sulfur utilizing bacteria I will tell you. So aerobic, anaerobic, sulfate reducing bacteria, the sulfate is converted to sulfides. There is an intermediate process also, neither aerobic nor anaerobic, we call it as a microaerophilic environment, where mineralization of this decomposition, mineralization of organic sulfur, where release of HS or SO4 2- takes place, and it gets converted into a volatile organic sulfur. Okay, so these are all the reactions on land, soil, atmosphere and ground. So we can say this is in general the terrestrial sulfur pool transformation map. Okay, so as I said, the process here, sulfate reduction, aerobic process, oxic on the top, and the bottom it is anoxic or aerobic. So this is done by chemolithotropic bacteria. The sulfate assimilation, desulfurylation by aerobic group of bacteria takes place. Sulfate reduction, dimethyl sulfide, it also takes place in the aerobic and anaerobic condition. Whether aerobic or anaerobic, the most oxidized form is converted into most reduced form, and most reduced form is converted into most oxidized form by a variety of bacteria. So let us just speed up through the name of the bacteria and the groups which are carrying out these key processes. In the prokaryotic kingdom, the key processes of this sulfur transformation is done by aerobic and anaerobic system. In the aerobic, sulfur chemolithotropes, Thiobacillus and Beggiatoa are the organisms. Beggiatoa is a group of organisms which is exclusively sulfur oxidizing, which converts hydrogen sulfide gas to elemental sulfur, that is sulfate disproportionation also takes place to the oxidized sulfur SO4 2-. In the anaerobic group, purple sulfur bacteria, green sulfur bacteria, which are phototropes, and some chemolithotropes are also involved. Sulfate reduction in the anaerobic process by SO4 2- to H2S is carried out by desulfovibrio, desulfobacter, archaeoglobus, that is it is archaea, which are also very good sulfate reducers. Sulfur reduction anaerobic is taking place by the help of the organism desulforomonas, and many hypothermophilic archaea bacterial species are also involved in it. Sulfur disproportionation, which I showed you in the previous slide, that is S2O3 2- to H2S and SO4 2-, it takes place by desulfovibrio and others. Organic sulfur compounds are oxidized and reduced, and many organisms they can do this. Desulfurization is conversion of organic sulfur to H2S, and this desulfurization reaction by the enzyme desulfurizase is a property or is a metabolic activity by many organisms. Many organisms can do this. So sulfur utilization by microorganisms, again I would recommend you to pause this slide, and just as I have given you the name of the organisms, the group of heterotrophs, obligate and facultative autotrophs, phototropes, heterotrophs, and microorganisms which can utilize sulfides, sulfates, H2S, and their conversion reactions in this column, where they are present, the habitat, anaerobic, organic, that is anoxic or aerobic or anaerobic environment, that is mentioned, habitats are mentioned, and the name of the specific organisms are mentioned. So this is how the sulfur utilization by many bacteria or the microbes in soil and aquatic habits, this is given here. So you can just pause this slide, pause this video, go through the slide. Exhaustive list of organisms is given, which will help you in most of the competitive examinations and the queries regarding sulfur utilization which you may have in your mind. So there are various types and sources of this sulfur gas. Okay, I am talking about now a volatile sulfide produced in soil. So microbial degradation of organic matter, when we talk about decomposition and decay, which is one important reaction in the sulfur cycle, decomposition. So that is microbial degradation of organic matter which takes place under aerobic and anaerobic conditions, which is mostly what is decomposed or what is decayed. Organic matter is there. It may be a dead plant, it may be a dead animal, it may be a dead insects which are decomposed, and during that the sulfur compounds which are released. We have seen this with respect to nitrogen, we have seen this with respect to carbon and phosphorus. Now I want to show you the amino acids. When they are decomposed, then the protein or the amino acids which are sulfur containing, they are released in the form of H2S gas or methyl mercaptan or dimethyl sulfide, that is DMS gas, or dimethyl disulfide gas, the carbon disulfide gas. As you can see, these are the volatile compounds. These are the compounds which are released during degradation or decomposition. And from where they are released? They are released from degradation of proteins, polypeptides, cysteine and cysteine enzymes, glutathione, that is vitamins, cofactors, then all these glycolic acid, lanthionine, all these elements, the biochemical precursors of enzymes, cofactors, vitamins, proteins, these are released in the form of gas, and this gas contains sulfur. That is what contributes to the atmospheric sulfur which we are talking about, assimilated or during the acid rains. These gaseous forms of sulfur are brought down back into the soil, and then they become a part of the soil sediment, and it becomes a part of the natural rock formation or the sediment formation in the earth's core or the crust. There are 5 groups of sulfur oxidizing bacteria. As I said, aerobic, anaerobic phototropes, green and purple sulfur bacteria. Second group, morphologically colorless sulfur bacteria, that is pleomorphic. They are morphologically conspicuous. They change their shape and size. They are colorless sulfur bacteria, that is Thiospira. Then third group is obligate autotrophic colorless sulfur bacteria like Thiobacillus, sulfolobus, Thiobacillus thioxidans, so on and so forth. There are variety of genera, species in this genera, Thiobacillus, which have the capacity of oxidizing the sulfur. These are chemolithotropes, which utilize inorganic compounds as their carbon and energy source. So facultative autotropes, which are again colorless sulfur bacteria, Thiobacillus. Obligate and facultative, 2 different groups of Thiobacillus exist. The species are different. Sulfur dependent archaea, that is Thermococcus, is the 5th group of sulfur oxidizing bacteria according to the Burgess Manual of Bacteriology. Finally, let us just come to see the sulfur cycle, how humans have been impacting this sulfur cycle to a great effect. Humans, when they mine, they from the ores they take out the sulfur. Sulfides are released into the soil during mining. Combustion of fossil fuels, we burn petrol, diesel, rock oil, etc., and this releases the sulfur dioxide into the air. It causes acid rains and increases the amount of sulfur in the ground or the soil. 28% of sulfur in rivers comes from pollution by humans, that is by the process of mining and soil erosion. The humans and their activities, they help to move the cycle, but they upset the balance too much. Means too much sulfuric acid or sulfur in the atmosphere means acidic rains, and hydrodesulfurization means refining the hydrocarbons gives a surplus of sulfur on this earth. So that is what you can say immobilized or assimilated in a wrong way. So the human activities which are there, burning of fossil fuels, processing of the metals which requires huge refineries or sulfur into the atmosphere, it releases the sulfur into the atmosphere. I will show you some photographs, real-time photographs of mining, which will give you a fair idea of how huge the human mining impact it is there. Human activities, they are responsible for around 1/3 of all the sulfur emissions and 90% of all the sulfur dioxide emissions into the atmosphere. Sulfur dioxide emission leads to acid rains, and sulfur dioxide reacts with water to form sulfuric acid, and this sulfuric acid and sulfur trioxides. These are added in the form of concentrated sulfuric acid into the soil. And sulfur cycle being very important to biological system, it should remain natural. It is a natural process, but humans, they are impacting it in a negative way. So you can see how the sulfur mining results into accumulation of sulfur. See the rocks which are there behind the people, that is huge boulders of sulfur mined from the earth's crust. Now this somewhat imbalances the immobilized form of sulfur. Okay, now all this sulfur which was trapped in the earth's core has been very fastly brought out into the soluble form by humans. Now again it has to re-enter into the cycle. That will take many years, and that is bound to cause imbalance. You can see how the smelting ore, now this causes acid mine drainage, AMD. When sulfur is mined from the ores, they have to be leached, means acid wash is there, and there are certain processes by which this sulfur mining takes place, which is not good for the environment. So huge ores of this sulfur mining takes place throughout the world, and it not only impacts the health of the workers, that is one totally different issue to be discussed, but we are talking about a global perspective, a major impact on the natural environmental cycle due to this human activity. See the processes. This is one big huge mine where sulfur is heaped in the huge forms, and this process, smelting ores, mining, this results into acid. This is acid form. And then where will this go? This will go either in the soil, or when it will rain, this will go into the form of rivers and acid mine drainage. Now this drain which is there, it is highly acidic. I know, just imagine this huge sort of acid, sulfuric acid, when it is carried away into the soil or into the water bodies or into the irrigation systems or agricultural systems. This is having disastrous effect on the environment. So environmental effects of sulfur oxidation is one huge impact is acid mine drainage, that is called as AMD. Mine, it spoils materials are stockpiled as wastes from mine excavation. Minerals in the the spoilage which is there, they contain pyrite, chalcopyrite, that is ferrous sulfate, and this ferrous sulfate is exposed to air, land, water. It accelerates the sulfur oxidation by the chemical and the physical, also up to some extent biological processes. Then when there is great rain, it is a part and parcel of the global cycle, and there is one season where it will rain very heavily, and this rain water leaches through the piles which is acidified. Acid flow takes place which solubilizes these metals, and this acid main drainage then leaches into the groundwater, goes to the lakes or the oceans, or in general you see this acid which is there in the picture, and there are farms in the vicinity. There are farms in the long run, 100 years, 1000 years, all these lands will be converted into fertile lands. So that is one long term very sad effect of this environmental effect of this sulfur mining. So this is all about the sulfur cycle. The final aim is to understand the sulfur cycle and have a industrial activity or a human activity with respect to the nature, means not disobeying the nature. Human activities should be there. Excess use of vehicles where we burn the fossil fuels, petrol and diesel, that also is contributing to the global warming. Okay, carbon dioxide is the major global warming gas, and along with it the temperature rise which is there is also due to the lead sulfur molecules which are transmitted through the silencer of the motor vehicles. So I hope you have now got a very good idea of how these elemental cycles, they impact the natural systems and how they are very important in maintaining the balance of the ecosystem and the food chain and the food web in general. So with respect to these, we end this unit here. My next part of discussions will be some microbial interactions. The next lectures will focus on microorganisms and their interactions with their environment and nature. So we will deal with some microbial interactions, microbial associations, and microbial ecology, okay, which will form the final unit of your syllabus. So I hope again, once again, that you have understood this lecture. You have understood the fineness of the interaction of microorganisms with these elements, and how important it is not only to transform from one state to the another, but again give back to the environment in which form it was originally taken. So that is the whole aim of understanding these series of elemental transfers. So till then, we venture into the interactions and ecology, where we will be dealing with symbiosis, parasitism like phenomenons, which the cell microorganisms in the soil, atmosphere, water, etc., they keep on doing to not only survive for themselves, but also to maintain the balance of the ecosystem. So till that time, study hard, try to understand at a deeper and a higher level, so that you can venture into the next level for becoming masters and researchers. So all the best for that. Thank you. See you soon.